All right, so what I want to do first here is I want to go back to Hebrews chapter 12. I want to do a little addendum on what we talked about last week, and then I want to pick up in verse 5 of chapter 12 and read just a few verses. Not going to cover all we did last week, but I want to show you something about discipline. Discipline done right. And so here in verse 5 of Hebrews 12, this is stuff we covered last week, but I want to bring it up again and then take you into the book of Psalms. And you have forgotten the exhortation which speaks to you as to sons. My son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor be discouraged when you are rebuked by Him. For whom the Lord loves, He chastens. So anybody that's disciplined or chastened by the Lord, He loves them. And He scourges every son whom He receives. So everybody who belongs to the Lord is going to be disciplined at times. And we talked about all that last week. Well, we understand that God does discipline His children. But what does that do for us? And that's what I want to just share a little quick bit about that. If you endure chastening, God deals with you as with sons. So everybody don't endure chastening, right? Many are called, few are chosen. So not everyone is able to endure hardship or chastening or any other thing. We read about that. If you'll think about the parable of the sower, 3 out of 4 don't get it. Only the last group gets it, right? And there's different situations. He talks about the word being sown on 4 different ground, right? 4 different types of ground. Well, the first 3, they don't get it. Something takes them out. Something causes them to not endure, right? But the last group, they do endure. And he says, if you endure chastening, God deals with you as sons. But then in verse 8 he says, but if you are without chastening, of which all, that means all of us, have become partakers, then you're illegitimate, not sons. So if you don't get chastened, if we don't get disciplined by God, we don't belong to Him. That's what the Bible's saying. And we covered this pretty thoroughly last week, but I want to take you on a little trip here before we get back in Deuteronomy. Furthermore, we have had human fathers who corrected us, and we paid them respect, right? Shall we not much more readily be in subjection to the Father of spirits and live? For they indeed for a few days chastened us, as seemed best to them, but He for our profit, that we may be partakers of His holiness. Now, no chastening seems to be joyful for the present. So that's one thing we can see. That His chastisement, when He disciplines us, it moves us into a greater dimension of holiness. It helps us get holier, and you're going to see that clearly in just a minute. It makes us more like Him. His discipline corrects us. We're like a ship that needs to be turned at times because we're going the wrong direction or we're starting to get off course. Everybody knows what that's like, right? You wake up one day and you think, wow, I can't believe I was dumb, right? Or whatever. You know, sometimes we make decisions, sometimes we get led astray, and so we're like a ship that needs to be turned back. He says, for they indeed for a few days chastened, that seemed best to them, but He for our profit, that we might be partakers of His holiness. So that's one key that we should say that we are. This is what discipline helps with. It helps with holiness, right? And that means basically that we're becoming more like God. And that's His design, is for us to be more like Him. That's one key to discipline. Now, no chastening seems to be joyful for the present, right? At that moment, but it's painful. Nevertheless, afterward, it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness. So, righteousness, I would say it this way. Righteousness is the outward manifestation of this that's inward. Holiness takes over inward. Righteousness is the outward display of that holiness taken over or getting greater emphasis in our life, right? You know, you watch people get married, right? A lot of times when people get married, they're total opposite on some things, right? This one likes sweet tea, this one likes unsweet tea, this one, you know. But over time, we rub off on each other. And so then you see somebody that's been married for a long time, and you say, man, they're just alike. Well, it wasn't that way in the beginning. You should have saw them, right? That's why the world says opposites attract. But really what's going on is you're attracted to something you lack a lot of times. And so that person has things that you lack, you have things they lack, and over time that meshes together and it creates two become one, right? I tell this on Amy and I, when we got married 31 years ago, she was, maybe you would call it naive, but she was like, if somebody did something wrong, she was like, well, they didn't mean to, right? And she was always that way. And I was way over here. I was like, everybody's up to something. I know they are. So we were opposites, right? So over time, she's helped balance me out, and I've helped balance her out. And so she realizes some people do bad, and they intend to do bad. And I realize that everybody is not up to something, right? So you see, and there's a lot of other things I could share about our life, how we've grown together. So that's what God's trying to do. He uses discipline to do that we become, that holiness starts taking bigger place in our life inwardly, and then that righteousness begins to show. Now, we're not talking about righteousness that's made up or designed by men. That's what the Pharisees fell into. Well, they're righteous because they do outward things that they do. But what God wants, and that's why salvation is all about the change of heart, right? You get a heart change, it starts working outward. What's going on inward starts coming outward. So what God is saying basically, the more I discipline you, the more that happens. You get holier, and righteousness becomes, and He says it's a peaceful fruit to those who have been trained by it. So think about this one. Now I want to take you to Psalm 119, and then we'll go back into Deuteronomy tonight. But in Psalm 119, there's some passages here that really got my attention in the last couple of days. Psalm 119, let's look at verse 65. Now listen what the psalmist is saying here to God, and listen how this arrangement comes out. I think you'll be encouraged by it, even though nobody likes a spanking or a whooping, as we say in certain parts of Kentucky and West Virginia. But there's a design. None of us are perfect, and we need trained and disciplined. That's part of the journey. He says, you have dealt well with your servant, O Lord, according to your word. So know this, that God will always deal with you according to His word. He won't deal with you by emotion. He won't deal with you based on what somebody else knows. He won't deal with you with some newfangled idea. God will always deal with you and I out of His word. He will never violate His word or veer from His word. So He said that's a good thought for all of us. He says, teach me good judgment and knowledge, for I believe your commandments. Now look what He says. Before I was afflicted, I went astray. And that's pretty powerful. He says, but now I keep your word. So sometimes we see something that's so tragic, and it may very well be in the natural, but in the spiritual, God may be doing. Let's not hide our heads in the sand. We've seen lots of people over the years. If you've been in the church for a while, you've seen lots of people over the years hit into trouble and come to Jesus. I mean, that's a lot of times that happens, you know. People didn't even think about Jesus before, thought they had life by the tail, and, you know, next morning the life had them by the tail. They woke up, they got a horrible diagnosis. They woke up like Job and lost everything. Some relationship walked out on them, whatever. But you know that God, He is so faithful to use troubled times to turn us to Him. Now, if you're God, think about this. If you're God and you're not going to force anybody to live forever with you, that's where God stops. In fact, in the New Testament, the Bible tells us to go out and compel them to come in. The word compel means you stop short of making somebody do something. In other words, you reach out to them, you provoke them in a good way, you plead with them, whatever, but you don't force them to do the right thing. Well, God don't do that. Because there'd be no relationship. People who are forced into something, there's really no relationship there. But God, if you're God and you're looking down here and you're seeing all these people that you've created and you want them to live, because He said it's not His will that any would perish, so what would you be doing? If life's always good and they're not responding to you, maybe you put a curve in the road. got a few wheels off the edge now. Let's talk, right? We don't know all that goes in, but I've told you all this story a lot, but it fits here again. I had some family who were the most blessed part of my family, the most blessed branch in the whole tree, financially in every kind of way like that. But they were not serving the Lord, so I went to pray one day on the creek bank, and I started praying for them. Lord, bless them, and I don't know, that was kind of, I don't know why I even said it that way, and the Lord said, this was an eye-opener for me. He said, bless them. He said, I have blessed them. He said, you need to pray that I'll break them. And they were somebody I'd loved, I was close to. But you understand that God has the whole picture in mind. He don't just see the moment, right? He sees all the way around the circle. Your life, my life, and everything. So sometimes God intervenes. Look what else He says. He says, before I was afflicted, I went astray. So before God had afflicted him, he was going the wrong direction, he's saying. But now I keep your word. So that affliction, what? Brought him back. How many people have you heard, even in the church at times, who weren't really serious with God? Then trouble came their way and they got serious about it, right? We've seen all that. That's not something, and we shouldn't be embarrassed about that. Why? Because everyone receives discipline. Remember, that was the point I drove home last week, that we shouldn't be embarrassed that we get a spanking from God, because everybody gets it. If you belong to Him. Now, if you're the person that don't get a spanking, then we're going to have an altar call in a minute. You got to get saved. Because if you're not getting any spankings, you ain't saved, right? And sometimes God, He works on us mentally, right? He works in our mind. We feel that conviction. We feel that sometimes, you've heard me say, people say, man, I've sinned, I've done horrible, and I feel horrible. And I say, good. Because if you can sin and not feel bad, we got a bigger problem, right? When we do wrong, that conviction's supposed to be working, right? And so that's the beauty of walking with God. And here's the catch. Everything He's doing is for us. He's all God before we ever showed up. So He's not trying to make Himself something more. He's more than enough already. From Sunday, omnipotent. He's everything. He sustains everything. So it's all for us. He sent His Son. Everything He does is for us. And then He says, before I was afflicted, I went astray. I keep your word now. You are good and do good. Teach me your statutes. The proud have forged a lie against me, but I will keep your precepts with my whole heart. Their heart is as fat as grease. Wow. God knows everything, doesn't He? But I delight in your law. And then He says, it is good for me that I have been afflicted. That I may learn your statutes. The law of your mouth is better to me than thousands of coins of gold and silver. This is kind of hard to get your mind around, but the book of Hebrews, where we're at first, says Jesus learned obedience by the things He suffered. It doesn't mean He was going astray like us, but He got disciplined along the journey. He was bringing His flesh into subjection. We see Him doing that many times. So you think about somebody that says, Lord, I'm glad you got my attention. Basically, He's saying, I'm glad you got my attention. And sometimes we get blinders and we get so focused on something. I'm going to stop right here with this, because I think everybody's got the point that discipline is something God uses for our benefit. But you remember Stickman, right? He's in the pisteo path. He's headed toward his destiny, right, with God. But sometimes Stickman can get his eyeballs off on something out here. And when he does, he can go astray. And sometimes God allows discipline, afflictions to come to get him to get back. What did Hebrews say last week? Let that which is lame be healed and turn back into the path. So that's what God does. He uses certain things to get us back to where He has designed for us. So think about that.